Hey everyone, it's Emily, and I gotta say, it's been so interesting following Nintendo's choices when it comes to how they're approaching physical games on the Switch 2. Now, outside of the whole key card debacle, which I've talked about extensively on this channel, what they're doing with the Nintendo Switch 2 versions of games, I just find so fascinating, especially as someone who doesn't plan on adopting the new Nintendo Switch 2 systems anytime soon. And I actually ran out to Target today to pick up the Switch 2 version of Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma to play on my Switch OLED. So something that I think Nintendo has done a really poor job in doing is clarifying what each of the 3 different Switch 2 red cartridges are. So today I want to go over the Nintendo Switch 2 games with you all and share how well they perform on the older Switch models, using the new Rune Factory game as my illustrative example on my OLED as well as my Switch devices. So as I mentioned, the Nintendo Switch 2 edition games are ones that are compatible with the old systems as well as the new systems. So they're kind of that cross-gen physical edition that Nintendo has been trying out. So if we check out the case for the Rune Factory game, we can identify that this is a Nintendo Switch 2 edition from a few different places. So right on the front, they have Nintendo Switch 2 edition written there right under the title. It's a little bit small, but it's clearly written there. It also has some fine print along with a QR code. It includes the Nintendo Switch game and the Nintendo Switch 2 edition upgrade pack, and it refers you to the website for support. I would say that the fine print is a little ambiguous. It doesn't really clearly state that this works on the regular Switches. You don't have to upgrade to a Switch 2 in order to play this game. And the other kind of tell that this is a Switch 2 edition game is on the spine, because after they have the title, they write Nintendo Switch 2 edition. And I don't know if the white spine is also a signal that this is a Nintendo Switch 2 game. I don't have any other ones to compare at the moment, but these are kind of the only tells that this is a Nintendo Switch 2 edition, meaning that this is cross-compatible with the Switch 2 as well as the older Switch models. So there's nothing that really stands out on the Switch 2 case that this is also compatible with the older Switch models, at least in my opinion. Sure, you could argue the fine text there says it's the Nintendo Switch game, but I would argue that the general public will have no idea that this is a different physical game compared to the other Switch 2 releases that have released on launch day. I have a lot more to say regarding how Nintendo has been handling the Switch 2 edition games and not doing a great job at communicating what they are, but let's look inside of this case and see how it differs from the regular Switch cases we are mostly all used to. If we crack this open and really notice, of course, it's red plastic, that means there's going to be red plastic on the inside, which I think is kind of a shame because we have this inner artwork here that I don't think reads very well in red, unfortunately. So if I lift this up, see how this has a nice, beautiful scene here. And I think it's really obscured by this red translucent kind of filter. I think there could be some cool ways to incorporate the red transparent plastic on inner cover art, but I don't think it's used very well, at least for the Rune Factory game. What's really nice about a lot of Marvelous games is that they often release a booklet inside. So this is nice and thick, and it's a nice colored manual like we're kind of used to in the old days, with a lot of information about the game itself. So it's a very kind of nostalgia thing to have there. And just like with the regular Switch games, it's nestled right there on the bottom. And these Switch cases are, of course, the same size as the regular Switch cases. And so they should line up nicely together on the shelf if you want to display them next to each other. I'll share how I plan on housing this on my shelves in a little bit, probably towards the end. But yeah, that is kind of what we look at when it comes to the physical release. But I wanted to get down to how you identify this is a Nintendo Switch edition on the game card itself. So looking at these game cartridges side by side, the red Switch 2 edition and the black Switch 1 version are almost identical, right? Other than in color, and of course, they're different games. But the other big distinguishing feature that kind of helps signal that this game is a Nintendo Switch 2 edition on the left is the first 2 letters in the code there at the bottom. So the code red and white on the black strip there, LN, that tells us that this is a Nintendo Switch 2 edition game. And this is also a way to distinguish from the other two types of Switch 2 games that are available, both the game key cards as well as the Switch 2 games that only run on the new Switch 2 models. Now, Rune Factory is the only Switch 2 game that I have on hand, so I'm going to refer to the Does It Play little summary here to explain the differences in the codes for the Switch 2 games and how there are 3 distinctive codes. So if the code starts with an LB, that means that this is a native Switch 2 game card, meaning this game will only be able to run on a Switch 2 system. And for the code LN, like Rune Factory here, this means that it plays both on the Switch 1 and Switch 2 devices. So you can have a cross-play if you wish to play on either device. And lastly, the LP code is for the game key cards. So this is not a true physical at all. All it does is that it triggers a download for the game digitally, and it's not physically available on the cartridge itself. So there's a lot of information you could glean just from the front side of the game cart. Now, if you flip the game carts over on the back, I wanted to quickly note that you can tell if you have a revised Switch cart or not for your Nintendo Switch 2 game, the same way as before. Now, I made a whole separate video on this topic if you're interested, but the main premise about why collectors like revised carts is that whenever you get game patches for a lot of games, some publishers will go ahead and put those game patches that you would normally have to download from the eShop directly on the new cart when they go to reprint it. And they indicate on the back of the cart that this is a revised cart that has the up-to-date patches. So if you're more interested in this topic, I have this video here that you could check out on my channel. And it's neat that they adopted the new format that they started incorporating last year regarding revisions. So those are just some of the identifying features when it comes to the Nintendo Switch 2 edition games. Unfortunately, if you're shopping online, it's not always easy to tell if a game is a Nintendo Switch 2 edition or not, because some of the retailers don't always put Nintendo Switch 2 edition in the title or in the description of their product page. And they also sometimes use old product images where they don't have the up-to-date look of what the game art looks like with Nintendo Switch 2 edition and the fine print with the QR code at the bottom. So I do recommend probably doing some due diligence before purchasing a game if you intend to buy a Switch 2 edition for the purpose of playing on an older Switch model. But now for the test of how well do these Nintendo Switch 2 editions play on these older Switch models. So I'm going to test out the OLED model here by inserting the cart and seeing how it plays. Now, I often primarily use my Switch models in handheld mode, so I'm going to capture footage just based off of that. So there is a day 1 patch for Rune Factory. As you'll see here, when I insert it, it's going to say that there is an update available. However, you can circumvent this and just start the software, which I'll do here, to show how it runs prior to any sort of patches. And I'm going to just show different snippets of just the initial couple minutes of the game. So this is by no means a review. There are plenty of reviews you could look if you are interested in this game specifically and how it runs on the regular Switch. But for the most part, I'm pretty impressed with how this runs. All the cutscenes, I think, are nice and crisp and run very well. The voice acting and all the colors and just the graphics, I think, look really nice. And when you eventually get to the world where you could roam around and jump and hack and slash things, everything felt very fluid and it didn't seem too cumbersome doing different tasks, at least again in this first initial area. One thing that is definitely noticeable, especially prior to the patch, are all of the pop-ins. So when you're walking around, especially if you look at the vegetation, like the trees and shrubs, you'll notice a lot of pop-ins with different textures and things. And in my opinion, this isn't as bad as a lot of the pop-ins that happened in Rune Factory 5, which at one point was a little bit unplayable for me on the Switch. So for the most part, I don't really have as much of an issue with how this runs on the regular Switch. Now, again, the Switch 2 version will definitely play this better with the upgrades and everything, but I think if you're not ready to get a Switch 2 model just yet and you want to play Rune Factory, this is definitely an option to go for. and enjoy the game prior to upgrading your hardware. And I think the game looks beautiful. I'm really excited to get further into this, actually. Rune Factory 4 is one of my favorite games, and I was disappointed with 5, but it does seem like they really stepped it up with Guardians of Azuma here. And here is a little bit of it running prior to the day 1 patch for the Switch Lite, and you'll notice the pop-ins still occur, but thanks to the smaller screen of the Switch Lite, it really helps with the resolution, I think, and makes the image quality not so bad, though of course the pop-ins are still a bit egregious prior to the day 1 patch. Now here's how it plays with the day 1 patch. There are still noticeable pop-ins that occur, but I do think it's a little bit less frequent than what we saw without the day 1 patch. But when the character isn't running around, I do think the pop-ins are a little bit less obvious, so that is something maybe to consider if you are going to be playing Rune Factory on the Switch 1 systems. So there you have it. This is how at least Rune Factory runs their Nintendo Switch 2 editions on the older Switch models. So you can decide whether or not you want to upgrade to the Nintendo Switch 2 model sooner rather than later, or if you are okay sticking with your older Switch model and waiting to upgrade. So something I'm sure I'll get plenty of questions about is, why am I buying these Switch 2 versions that are $10 more when I only have a Switch OLED to play? Well, the simple response to this is I plan on getting a Switch 2 eventually. I'm not sure if it's going to be a year from now or longer. I'm really waiting for those Switch 2 exclusives before I kind of dive in. And I'm also kind of hoping I'll get a better version of the Switch 2, maybe an OLED version or a special edition, before I kind of make the jump. But in the meantime, I still want to play Rune Factory, and I don't really want to buy the Switch 1 version of the game that doesn't include the upgraded pack on the cart, like the Switch 2 version here does. So I don't want to double dip, and as someone who really appreciates physical media as a way to play games and have ownership, I don't want to, of course, rely on digital storefronts or some other means. So I usually like to get the most complete version available for my collection, and I could see myself revisiting Rune Factory in years' time when I do have the Switch 2, that I could take advantage of the upgrade pack. But for now, I'm totally happy with playing the regular Switch 1 version on my OLED. Now, is this an approach that everyone should take? No, not necessarily. That's why they also made the regular Switch 1 version, if you are happy with that and you have no plans on buying the Switch 2 at all. But if you think you may buy the Switch 2 system at some point and you are excited to play Rune Factory right away, this is something that you may also want to consider, especially if you enjoy collecting physical media and having game ownership with your purchases. Now, I've sort of saved my rant for the end here, but I think Nintendo is doing a huge disservice not really clarifying what the Nintendo Switch 2 edition really is, at least to the general public. I'm sure they have kind of a loose response on their support page, and if you contact Nintendo, they'll kind of help clarify that, yes, this Switch 2 edition game can play on the regular Switch 1 consoles, but there's nothing really on the case here that strongly makes it clear that you could play this on the regular Switch model. I think they probably should put something on here, at least on the back, to make that obvious for parents or family members who maybe don't game themselves, if they're buying games for their children or gifts or something like that. And hopefully when we have the next Nintendo Direct, it'll be very clear what the Nintendo Switch editions actually mean when they are advertising the upcoming ones. That'll be coming out soon. Like for the new Pokemon and Metroid, there's a handful of games, both first party and third party, that I think will be going this Nintendo Switch 2 edition route that I don't see why they wouldn't clarify, because not everyone is going to adopt the Switch 2 edition at launch or close to launch. So you would think they would want the software sales to be there. But I suppose you could argue that's why they are also releasing the Switch 1 versions of many of these games that are coming out soon. But I do think there will be some confusion of people buying the base Switch 1 edition of the game because they haven't upgraded to a Switch 2 model, not knowing they could have bought the Switch 2 edition of their game with the upgrade pack on the cart as a way to kind of future-proof their purchase. So they don't have to exchange it or, I guess, double dip if they are physical game collectors, and knowing that this is the more definitive version of the game if they want it on the cart. Now, this all may be something that only physical game collectors care about. That may be true, but I do think when people go and say buy a physical game, they have this expectation that when they insert it into their console, they're not going to have to be delayed to play said game, of having to go through the process of downloading things and waiting for it to be ready for them to play. Given the Switch 2's problem with storage capacity and how it's not so big, especially with all the large digital games that people will probably inevitably be downloading, I'm sure saving space and having most of the game on the cart itself rather than on their storage device would be ideal. So where will I be storing my new Nintendo Switch 2 game? Well, here is an overview of my current shelf setup where the bulk of my games lie. And I have quite a lot of space dedicated to my Switch 2 section. And of course, other consoles I collect for. I could do one of two things here. I can have my new game integrated with the rest of my Switch 1 titles in that sea of red, but the white spine, as you'll see here, really sticks out. So this is really not ideal, and how they wrap around that red forehead too to indicate it's a Switch 2 game, it looks a little bit odd. I'm gonna take this out. So instead, I'm going to give the Switch 2 section its own dedicated spot down here right below my Switch 1 games. And I think this section is not going to grow extensively anytime soon. So that little space I made, I think should be perfect for housing all my Switch 2 games at this time. But that's it for this video, and I'm curious for those who haven't upgraded to a Switch 2 system yet, if you are also planning to buy some of these Switch 2 edition games in the future, I'd love to know. But until my next video, bye guys.